Ladies and gentlemen, let's gaming Center.com video. We have yet another update to AMD's Mantle technology, and there are 4 core principles towards it that AMD have been publicizing. We will go into those in just a moment. So, just yesterday, there was an update from both AMD and Microsoft. AMD saying that the Mantle technology was aimed primarily for the PC platform, although they had said that consoles could technically use it, but they weren't really expecting it. And Microsoft piped in, and then they said, well, you know what, we're focusing on DirectX 11.x, and that has a subset, those were their words, of DirectX 11.2 components, including but not limited to, of course, the rather infamous by now tiled resources. So, fast forward one day, and AMD have been asked to provide further clarifications. Now, I would like to point out, of course, that not all of the technology, not all of the information is currently available, but we will be certainly doing our best to go through what is. So, the last month or so has been incredibly busy for AMD. Of course, they unveiled their Radeon R9 and R7 series GPUs. The lower end R9s, for example, the 280X and below, haven't exactly set the world on fire. In fact, AMD have gotten some accusations of basically rebranding, which is pretty common practice, to be honest with you, in the GPU industry, but the R9 290 and 290X are looking to be incredibly impressive. Obviously, they are not currently unveiled yet, as the time of my recording this anyway, so we don't have any performance benchmarks, but the rumors show that it's going to be 5 to maybe even a 5.5 T-flop device. But probably the most exciting thing from the perspective of many consumers, especially developers, was actually Mantle. Now, of course, Mantle is low-level access to the PC's GPU hardware, and it's AMD are calling it for the very first time, and that's not technically true. Maybe to this extent, but Glide, for example, obviously has been unveiled well before this, way back in the 90s, with 3DFX, and we know about that. But anyway, from a mile-high perspective, this is AMD's quote: Mantle is the harmony of 3 essential ingredients, a thin driver within AMD's Catalyst software suite that allows applications to speak directly to the GCN architecture. GCN architectures, of course, Radeon 7000 and above. The GCN next enable graphics chips such as the R9, R7 or the HD 7000. An application or game engine written to utilize Mantle SDK. SDK, by the way, is a source development kit, such as the Frostbite 3 engine within Battlefield 4. So, let's start looking into this a little bit in depth, shall we? Now, I know what you're going to say. Am I going to be writing an article on this? I will be. But as regular viewers may know, I will be doing some diagrams and stuff in the article. However, we can't technically update the website yet because I'm moving it to a new server. And so it's just a bit dicey writing things because it's only just me. So it's a little bit of a pain in the buttocks to get some continuity between them. It's a bit of a pain in the butt. So it'll probably be a bit later since we don't have all the Mantle information anyway. It makes sense to wait a couple of weeks. And the site won't take that long anyway, but still. So, unfortunately, you're just going to have to deal with either Googling yourselves and trying to put the stuff together, or you can just wait a week or so and I'll, do it all for you in some really cool articles and other bits and bobs. So, it's up to you, my good friend. Anyway, so, as I said, AMD are boiling this down to 4 core principles, and it's kind of like the building blocks of the reasons for Mantle. And, of course, the primary one is helping developers. Mantle represents years of collaboration effort between the gaming industry and AMD, and it comes at their request. That's what AMD is saying. They are saying that they didn't decide, oh, you know what we're going to do. The developers themselves have requested this technology. And over the years, games developers have often expressed interest in a more efficient way to harness the power of the GPU on PCs, and for a way of streamline the writing of efficient graphics code on multiple platforms. They also added, at present, each console currently available for purchase on today's market runs on a substantially different graphics architecture from the next, which is very true, of course, and each of those consoles substantially differs the graphics hardware available for the latest PC video cards. It's quite messy for developers who must make some difficult choices for the for the precious commodity that is their development time. Do they spend the time optimizing performance for each specific architecture? This opportunity costs that they have a lot less time to spend implementing unique visual and graphical effects. Do they emphasize the performance and image quality of a specific architecture? This means that obviously other platforms suffer as a result of this, and do they spend their time optimizing for the PC or the console version of the game? The opportunity cost on either PC gamers or console gamers suffer. Maybe a PC version never exists at all and comes at a significant delay, or at best suffers from consolitis, which of course in the industry means a practice where a PC game is basically bastardized to accommodate the rather limited console architectures or control systems or whatever. This was really prevalent in the previous generation. This is out of quote. It's not really going to be so much of a big deal next generation, but obviously we're at the point now where the Xbox 360 and PS3 are really not that powerful at all. And so obviously next generation titles on both PC and the PlayStation 4 and so on are hugely different. So anyway, the premise of the GCN architecture is the hardware answer to these concerns, unifying the console ecosystem and much of the PC market. Remember that AMD have, of course, a good presence in the PC side of things, but also they are providing the GPU for both Microsoft and the PS4, and under a common graphical architecture. But Mantle is a software remedy for these difficult choices, allowing developers to uniformly work across multiple platforms in a single endeavor. Consoles and PCs may be treated equitably. It's not that Mantle is the initial language developers are writing the game for each platform, as some of those have surmised. The point of Mantle is it's easy to reuse in whole or in part. The development effort expanded on the next generation consoles when the same game to life on PCs, because Mantle allows developers to use the same features and programming techniques already utilized for next gen game consoles, that in other words the PS4 and Xbox One. While the initial iteration of Mantle is designed specifically for PCs, it has been designed from the beginning to be extensible to other platforms as well. And Mantle aside, the gaming industry practice standardization on GCN architectures alleviates a considerable burden on developers. Developers now are significantly less concerned with learning the intimate inner workings of half a dozen graphics architectures, and that affords them the opportunity to spend more time on making a game look great or run great. Now, I would like to point something out here. It's kind of true, but I'd like to point out that the issues with that are obvious. Not all not all gamers are going to be using the GCN architectures, and not all gamers are going to be using AMD. And so, obviously, if you're a NVIDIA fan, or you're owning a NVIDIA hardware, or you're owning an AMD card that's not GCN, so for example, you're owning like a HD 6970 or something like that, then you're SOL. So, in other words, developers are still going to have to kind of worry about this stuff somewhat. But anyway, so what about the second essential principle? Well, it's actually for us, helping gamers get better performance out of their hardware. This is a pretty long post, so I'm going to somewhat summarize it for you guys, because I'll be here until Christmas, and pretty much a lot of it is just marketing spiel anyway, so I'm just going to summarize it for you. But the PC gaming environment is a maze of abstraction layers, so AMD say now. Abstraction layers are basically a piece of software, and they help to cause a common way for developers to be able to communicate with the hardware. But the problem with that is it's great for compatibility, but it also reduces the performance in the GPU. So there's actually problems with this. I mean, Microsoft have tried to address them, as I've said in another Mantle video, way back on even DX10 and into DirectX 11, there were improvements on their architectures which help to facilitate better draw calls, reduce CPU overhead, and so on and so on. But the reality of the matter is it's just not helped that much compared to what it should be. And I don't particularly blame Microsoft. That's the thing. I'm not saying, Microsoft, you are idiots. You are the ones responsible. It's actually kind of not. It's just the fact of the matter is, it's very difficult to fix this in one iteration, because if you do, you risk starting to break compatibility. So the idea is that Mantle will be actually exposing a large variety of hardware features that aren't currently available in existing graphics APIs. Now, for those of you who are not too familiar with them, the biggest on the market right now is Opengl and, of course, DirectX. I mentioned previously that Gabe Newell isn't actually best buddies with, sorry, not Gabe Newell, I'm sorry. John Carmack actually prefers Opengl for a plethora of different reasons. He believes it's just better performance and compatibility, cross-compatibility from what I understand. But anyway, so today's graphics APIs still offer flexibility to take multiple different approaches. In other words, there's not just one way to write a piece of code. This is one of the very simple ways you can do arithmetic, for example, arithmetic operations, for example, in programming languages, and a lot of basic maths are involved, not necessarily even that you have to necessarily think of ahead of time, but a lot of calculations, operations, whatever. There's many ways of going about it. So because of that, programming is very open-ended. So modern day GPUs and modern day APIs, there's tons of different ways of doing it. But because there's such a thick abstraction layer, it's so thick and heavy that it's very difficult to get the most out of the system. So Mantle is basically created to be able to just, well, access it with minimal amount of, well, distractions. So as a company, this is from AMD, we do not chase 1 or 2 percentage points of performance when we go and set our minds as a project of as elaborate as historic as Mantle. But it remains too early to disclose performance figures. We expect you will be pleasantly surprised with Battlefield 4 patched to support Mantle in December, and with Mantle back and baked into Frostbite 3, you can expect other games and engines to reap all of its benefits. So I think that's pretty clear. There has not been any indication of how good Mantle is, other than them stating, numbers such as, 4, 8 times better in terms of draw calls and whatever. That does not mean that that without Mantle, you're going to be getting like 60 frames a second, and with Mantle, you're going to be getting like 240 or, 400 or 500 frames a second, of course. But I would not be surprised if there is a substantial increase. I'm not going to give you a number on substantial because I actually have absolutely no idea. If I had to be honest, I would imagine it would highly depend on the amount of anti-aliasing and stropic filtering. I imagine it would depend on the type of game. I imagine it would depend on the resolution and the remainder of the hardware. So, for example, if your title is running into, let's go with texture difficulties, because there's not enough memory on your GPU to begin with and you're playing on high resolutions, it probably would not help as much as if that's not the problem. So I guess we'll just have to see. But apparently the other essential principle is it's bringing back innovation to graphics APIs. It wasn't long ago that graphics APIs were the arms race to continuously provide flashiest graphics and the best performance as quickly as the schedule for these things would allow. But you've probably noticed in the past that it's slowed of late. Developers are waiting for innovations in the graphics APIs that enable them to drive increasingly complex rendering workloads more efficiency. A typical example of this would be the ability to process draw calls in parallel across multiple cores to avoid CPU bottlenecks. Draw calls, of course, just out of a quote from a moment, draw calls, of course, is basically the CPU wanting to tell the GPU, well, actually, you know what, I need you to process and create this lamp here and this item here and this there. And games aren't exactly brilliant right now at taking full advantage of well, multi-processor environments anyway. But anyway, I'm going to continue. Accessing more of the GPU features to its other, gamers deserve better, and we want to give it to you as a more complete graphics API. Mantle must be capable of coding and rendering across all of the game effects you see today, but Mantle also needs to be sufficiently extensible so that we can collaborate with game studios to create the effects of tomorrow. Mantle is not a replacement for things such as DirectX. There is and will continue to be a need for the market for the graphics program interfaces and languages that can support a broad range of existing and future GPUs. Mantle complements those programming models by providing new options for developers looking to extract more of the performance. We believe it will serve as a proof of concept and will guide evolution of industry standard APIs. The beauty of Mantle is it's born and raised, and yes, the playground it was spending most of its days, in the loving arms of people. I'm sorry, it's making me snigger now. Loving arms, it's just quite funny because, out of quote, of course, but people may think that being a bit sarcastic, but that we're using marketing speak, it's actually not. A lot of the time when you're coding something or you're creating something, you really do treat it as your baby because you've been working on the sucker for like, a couple of years often. So by that point, it becomes basically your best buddy and your best friend in the whole wide world. But anyway, who are relentlessly obsessed with pushing the envelope of PC graphics. AMD's graphics division, powerful developers like DICE at AMD, we crave gamers. Cave games that push our hardware to the limits. We won't design newer, more powerful hardware to support the status quo. And at DICE, brilliant software engineers are constantly looking to push games engines to a new degree of realism. Everyone is being dazzled by spectacular graphics. Everyone loves it. Together, we are working on a philosophical and practical version for how games should look and run in the future, and we can get to that future from where we are today. Mantle has the adaptable and upgradable nature to support that effort. So, that's a hell of a lot of wording, but effectively, what they're saying there is that we're not going to be saying, well, toodaloo to DX11 and its versions. Now, I personally am not going to argue with AMD here. If you actually look at the speed DirectX used to be updated, it was pretty damn fast, honestly. Now we're getting very small incremental upgrades, and there's reasons behind that. Of course, Microsoft are trying to push it to as many different platforms as possible. You've got the whole issue of, well, Windows 7 doesn't get 11.2, DX 11.2, Windows 8 does, and it's just a mess, honestly. This is another reason, may I add, why Gabe doesn't like Windows, because he doesn't like the rather closed architecture. He doesn't believe it's really a good thing for gamers. In one respect, Mantle could actually be a very good thing for Linux, assuming, it all works well and so on the Linux hardware. Obviously, we have no real idea yet of any of the performance benchmarks, how it's going to translate or anything like that. So I'm not going to, give you guys information that's not necessarily true. But anyway, the central principle 4 is don't break games. While Mantle is uniquely optimized for PC contained in the GCN architecture, we recognize there are some architectures we recognize that other architectures in the market, gamers with those architectures deserve good gameplay as much as anyone else. And we haven't designed Mantle in a way that respects their rights to... I'm sorry, I'm completely and utterly screwed that up. And we haven't designed Mantle in a way that respects their rights to game well. Developers using Mantle are free to implement whatever optimizations they choose to maximize the performance of the games to everyone. Now more than ever, Mantle assures that there are choices a developer must make to optimize their game code for the leading PC architectures are non-interfering choices. So, the natural question which AMD are asking is, well, where do we go from here? So, they're saying that the basic principle right now is Mantle is new, and it's going to bring basically code developers are already writing for next-gen consoles to PC. So it achieves this by being similar to and often compatible with code that's already written for those platforms. That is incredibly important, because if that basically means that PSSL and DX11 and so on are very easy to just port onto Mantle, it could mean very good things for AMD and the PC architecture as a whole. The ultimate goal of Mantle is to give gamers the ultimate performance in compatible games, says AMD, and doing so in a way that developers are free to put forth whatever effort is required to ensure optimal performance for competing platforms. With that in mind, there's still much to be said on Mantle, and we will still do that at the AMD Developers Summit, APU 2013, but that's going to be in November, by the way. And Chief Architect at DICE will present in the keynote. So, there you have it. I mean, I think it's going to be immense, honestly. I think that when they unveil this stuff, I think it's going to be pretty huge for everyone involved. My personal perspective on this is that people have been really concerned with Mantle, including myself. I've mentioned my own concerns with it, because the problem with Mantle, of course, is that I don't want another glide situation, and it was kind of messy. Way back when I first started to really get into PCs, I was pretty young at the time, and I honestly didn't realize, because I was really young, and obviously I didn't know much about tech and so on. I basically was gaming with an AMD processor. I can't remember the type now. It was a K62 something. I think I had 360 something megahertz, and then I think I put in a 500 megahertz. I think that's from pure memory, though. We're talking years ago. And I had a Voodoo 2 and also had a Voodoo 3 card. I went from Voodoo 2 to Voodoo 3. I didn't realize until, maybe a couple of years after I bought my PC, and it was, of course, a pre-made PC that my parents got me and so on when I was young. And I didn't realize at the time that, because things were really, basic back then. We were, of course, on Windows 98 and so on, and things weren't that extensive. There was nowhere near as much as hardware support as there is now. Games weren't so well optimized in terms of being easy to utilize. DirectX versions used to be really iffy, and I didn't realize it, but my PC would just randomly crash when I was playing games, and I didn't honestly know why. I figured it was maybe heat at some point, so I was checking that out, and I was, young, so I was doing things like pointing at desk fans inside the PC. That didn't work, and I was just kind of messing about, and it just turns out that it happened to be a combination, and I didn't find this out until, a year or so later, but it happened to be something like Glide without certain drivers, without certain Windows updates, and without an AMD CPU extension known as 3D Now. I'm not going to go into exactly what 3D Now is, but suffice to say, it just allowed data to be much better managed on the CPU registers. It was basically just an extension, a bit like SSE and so on. And it was problems, because with all of those competing different platforms, because back then you had Glide, you had Opengl, and you also had software rendering. I think that was a version of Direct 3D. I don't honestly remember. And there was also D3D hardware. So there was like 3 to 4 renderers in a game often, and basically you would have problems. And so what people are concerned with is that, look, you do that, and games themselves, the time to actually create a game is going to be, split between how many renderers. So if this is true, if the console code could be very much optimized for it, the bottom line is PC hardware is basically being strangled because of these extremely thick and heavy abstraction layers. PC hardware is basically being held back, and you know, if it wasn't, PC technology would start moving on at a ridiculous pace, and audio is pretty much the same as well. I mean, if you actually look at PC audio technology, it's been really held back recently because of just the way that the Windows sound stack has been recreated in, I believe it was Vista that really started to redo it, but it was also Windows 7 as well. And of course, that means that yes, PC gamers still get better looking graphics than console gamers, but it also means that we are playing basically on higher spec systems than what we technically should need to. In other words, I'm just going to make this up. I don't know the performance numbers, so I'm not saying this is real. I'm just giving this as a pure example. But let's just assume, for the purposes of argument, that you know, you have Battlefield 4, and I believe from the benchmarks that I've looked at with with 1920 by 1080, so true 1080p, 4 times MSAA, all the ultra quality. So technically, it looks better than the PlayStation 4 and so on. So we're told by DICE. Obviously, I haven't looked at both versions running with all the max settings and everything like that. But that gets about 60 frames a second, slightly under actually. But what it could be with Mantle is, let's say that goes to 80 frames a second, or 85 or whatever. Let's just make up a number. In theory, that would mean that a cheaper graphics card could easily outperform it. And I know what you're going to say. Well, how are you what are you basing this on? Well, if you look at the performance of the graphics cards that we're talking about, we're talking like 3 or 4 T-flop GPUs. I mean, for goodness sake, the new 290X is rumored to be 5.5 T-flops. The PS4 is like 1.84 T-flops. And so we've got these huge overheads at the moment. That's fine because PC hardware can, just soldier past it, and that's great. But what basically they're saying is that, look, if these abstraction layers weren't so thick, if we could better access the GPUs, the shadows, everything that we really want to see would just be incredible. And more to the point, this is another reason I like it. Let's say you don't have much money and you can't afford the highest end GPU available, or a high-end GPU. Even a cheaper GPU with this would probably perform as well as a console. So you could buy like a cheap-ass GPU and it'd probably perform as well as a console. And that's a very good thing in my opinion. It helps to bring games forward. And it's pretty damn exciting in my opinion. I've got some ideas on this, but I'm going to wait over the next couple of weeks because I want to see how everything develops. I want to see this developers conference, but I've got some ideas how things are going to start moving forward, but it's a bit early for me to start saying anything yet because I don't want to get people's hopes up and I need to get some confirmations from developers. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. It was ridiculously longer than I originally anticipated, but there you have it. Anyway, I'm going to get going, so I'll see you soon. Bye for now.